Everyone. So we're going to talk about kind of a few different things this week. And to start with sort of a revamp or a sort of review of what we did last week, and sort of talk about a couple of principles of development that I think are useful for you to consider as you're sort of moving forward this practice. And the two principles that I want to mention are, one is called DRY, D-R-Y, don't repeat yourself. And the other is the idea of so-called convention over configuration. And the way that this relates to what we were doing the other week is, I have here the example of oops, that's actually old hand. Right, so we have our example of our web page, our Bootstrap web page from last week, right? And in our case, we just had sort of the one button that allowed you to view a video, and I know there were some issues with that, but in principle, you guys get the idea, right? You can have content appear, and of course, we have this wonderful responsive design. So what I want to address is, what if you had a situation, a lot of you, this isn't sort of directly user input, but it's user action. What if you wanted to be able to change something on the basis of a user action? And so the example that I'm going to use is the idea of us having additional content for each of these, like sort of a read more additional content for each of these pieces, and how we would do that and how we would do that in sort of the most optimal way. So right now, the way we have our script set up is that our button is using the class Cyclone. On our button, it's grabbing the button by the class Cyclone, and it's saying here's a click event. And so the issue that we're dealing with is, what if we wanted different content to appear based on which button you clicked? So I'm just going to sort of do some sample content here. So imagine this is JSON. It could obviously exist here, but probably you'd actually be loading this dynamically. But you kind of get the idea. So what are we saying? It's Cyclone and more info about Cyclone. So one of the things that I'm going to, so what we're looking at right now is this, is just putting some sample content in here. I think we also have Wonder Wheel. And already I think you can see that I'm using this idea of convention over configuration in this, because you may notice that I have three sort of info properties, these are going to be my additional text, and that I'm being consistent in the way that I'm naming them. That is not an accident, right? What you'll see is I have Cyclone, info, 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 right? And the reason for that is that we're actually going to make use of that pattern. The fact that there's that convention, that pattern there, is actually going to help us make our code more efficient and kind of grab things and put them in the right place. Parachute. Okay, so not very compelling sample content, but hopefully you guys can bear with me on this one. So at the moment, what we have is we have one piece, we have one section that has one button, right? But again, imagine that I want this to be like a read more button, and I want to have one in each section. And so I'm going to do that. And I'm going to put another one here. Now the trick is that right now I could use this as it is, and I could make this one say Wonder Wheel, and I could add a class of Parachute to this one, right? And then I could come back to my scripts and say, okay, I want to make this is junk. I want to have another button, so I'm going to do this, and this one's going to say Parachute, and this one's going to say Wonder Wheel, right? But very soon, what we see is that we're running into this DRY principle, this DRY principle. Don't repeat yourself, right? Because ultimately, what I would end up doing is I would end up writing three click handlers that are probably pretty much the same, right? Basically, what I want each click handler to do, what I will want each click handler to do, is to kind of like get the appropriate piece of information, the corresponding piece of information from this JSON object, and put it in my div, right? And so while the specific content is different, the action is the same, right? It basically says like find the when somebody clicks this button, find the appropriate piece of information and then put it in this particular div. Now, as always, there's multiple ways to go about this. What I like to do is I like to use the ID field, and Chris has chosen to use the class. I think the ID is a little bit easier in this case because it's unique and there's only one of them, whereas even now we have multiple classes, and that might mean we have to do a little bit of string manipulation in order to kind of get what we need from them. But basically what I want to point out is that, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do two things. I'm going to give my buttons IDs. I should make sure that I'm actually in the right one. Okay, so I'm going to give my buttons IDs. So I'm going to say ID equals cyclone, and then this one is going to be, ID equals Wonder Wheel. And again, if you notice that I'm using literally exactly the same string for the ID, for the ID that I used in my JSON object, right? So this says parachute, and if I look back here, it says parachute info. Wonder Wheel here, Wonder Wheel info, right? So hopefully you can start to see sort of where I'm going with this, right? If I use that ID, if I literally use the same string in different places, then I can use the ID of this button to identify the correct piece of content from my JSON, right? So again, this is the convention over configuration. I use a convention, which is the ID, corresponds to the name of the parameter in the JSON object. And I can use that to get all of the information that I need. Of course, this is possible because I'm controlling this whole process, right? I get to decide what, I define my JSON, I define my HTML and my IDs, and so I can do this, right? I can actually make my life really, really simple, much simpler, by simply just saying, look, this is going to be this sort of structural relationship between among the names of things. So the other thing that I need to do, and again, this is something, there's a bunch of different ways to do this, but this is how I'm going to do it. I'm actually also going to go ahead and add an ID to the individual div classes. If there's time, I'll demo another way to handle this situation that sort of works with the fact that this button is actually inside the div that I want it to add content to. But I like this one because in case things are in disparate places on the page, it works. So I'm just going to call this now, Wonder Wheel div, right? Like, nothing really genius going on here, but adding, another identifier. So my ID here is going, of course, to be cyclone div, and again, using this convention. So it's not the exact same convention, but the important part of it is distinct, right? That it's going to be parachute, cyclone, Wonder Wheel, which matches the IDs on the buttons, which matches the parameters of the JSON object, et cetera, et cetera. So here we go. Parachute div, and you can see I'm using camel case. Obviously there's different conventions for different things, but I like camel case. All right, so how is this going to help us? So the reason why we have this individual thing here, we notice that we're doing this sort of specific thing. Now, in order to avoid, now we have our distinct IDs, it's not obvious that we've solved the problem of having to write 3 different click handlers, right? Because, I need to say, this could just as easily be, this. And of course, if we load up our page again, we reload our page, we see that this should launch the modal. Fine, but if I do it on this one, nothing happens because it has a different ID. So I still want to assign my click handler by class. I'm going to do it, though, by a different piece of the class. So I'm actually going to take this bit off. And in this case, I'm going to use button success. Now, I might want to add, and it's actually perfectly fine to add classes in the way that, which is what in Chris's example we did, which is to add classes that are simply an identifier, right? They don't actually have any styling value, but they're sort of an additional identifier. In this case, button success is our button success comes from Bootstrap, so that might, if I were using other instances of these buttons elsewhere on the page, I might not want to do this exactly. I might add my own class, but hopefully you'll get the idea. So basically, all of my buttons need to do the same thing. They need to grab content from my JSON object, and they need to add it to the div add it to the appropriate div. And so because of that, I can use this class, because those are the only buttons on the page, I can use this class to grab them all. So I can say, okay, look, for all of these buttons on click. But now we have a problem, right? Which is, how do we distinguish which button was clicked so we know which content to grab and where to put it? So one thing that isn't in our current version, here, I'll just comment this out actually. Okay, so I'm not going to put this into the modal, but I could. I guess I could put it into the modal. Why not? Let's put it into the modal. No, I don't want to do that. Okay, sorry, figuring out what I want to do. All right, so we have our click handler, and although we do not have to use it, it's worth noting, I mean, it's important to know that every time a user does something, in fact, we've actually seen this with other things, right? We've seen this with document ready. We've actually seen this with our get function, or we haven't, I don't think we've actually used it for document ready. There is actually an object that is generated that says, look, the document is ready. You can think of it as like a ball, right? When the document is ready, it kind of throws that ball to your event handler, and the event handler says, right, I caught this ball. I know that that's happened. Now I'm going to move on and do other things. Well, it's a little bit more sensible, I think, for us to imagine as it is that when a user does something like click or roll over, the page actually generates an event. And you know, I like to think of these things as ball because I like to think of them as being able to be passed around, right? Because they get passed from the action, from the button to something, to the event handler, right? And there is actually an object there. And while we don't have to use it, it's very handy. And the convention is to use, the sort of broader convention is to use E to represent the, in this case, the click event. It would be a mouse over event or a mouse out event if we were writing something else, is to use E to represent that because E for event, right? You could also say event, it doesn't really matter. But E, so E has a whole bunch of properties attached to it. And one of these properties is the so-called target property. And what does the target property give us? But it actually gives us the HTML element that was the target of the action, right? So if I click that button, e.target is going to give me back that button. So I can see this in action here by coming to Firebug. And in my console, I will note that in this case, it returns the Cyclone class button. In this case, it returns the Wonder Wheel button. And in this case, of course, it returns the Parachute button. So now that I know that, I can use the ID as a way to construct the values that I need in order to manipulate my content. So I'm going to say var my ID equals e target ID. That's the way I can get straight at that string. And now I want to say, look, I want to grab the div to which I would like to append content, and I've called this is where I've given it this this div name, you know, cyclone div, parachute div, etc. So I'm literally gonna construct that string. So I'm gonna say, okay, look, I want you to go get, grab by div name the thing that is my ID plus the string div. Right? And since I know that in each case that my ID is going to reflect the ID of the button, if I click the Cyclone button, this will evaluate to, right? This will add up to hashtag Cyclone div, which is of course the name of the div that I want to append content to. So I'm going to say grab that, and I'm going to say append, right? Which we've seen, or maybe we haven't seen, but this is how I can append content. And I'm actually going to I'm just going to append the text right now. I'm not going to worry about sort of formatting it nicely. We'll see that in later issues. But basically what I can say is I want to say, look, get more info dot, actually, sorry, I have to use square brackets for this, I think. You can get more info, and then the my ID again, plus info. Now, we'll talk in class about the sort of strategy I'm using here, but I think this should work. So let's find out. There we go. Now, this is a very crude way of doing it, and we'll talk about why I used square brackets instead of a dot here in class. Basically, it has to do with how the JavaScript understands it. But I just wanted to show you guys this as an example of how we can use this concept of convention and configuration and don't repeat yourself as a way to, for example, be able to add a click handler to lots of buttons at once and still get unique behavior and unique content. So again, just to make sure that we're actually getting the thing that we say we are, there's the Cyclone information, right? This is a really important concept because it's not a big deal if you only have 2 or 3 or 4 buttons on a page to write them individually, but if you get beyond that, it's going to start to become really problematic. And so that's why we want to make sure that we're able to design these things in a way such that the interaction and the information scales so that we have the ability to do it with more complex data sets. So anyhow, as I said, we'll talk about this more in class and as needed for your projects, but wanted to give a quick intro, and I'll be back in a few minutes with a couple of other tidbits that we discussed in class.